Young, and the restless spoilers. The confrontation at the Genoa City Athletic Club changed everything, not because it involved power or money or corporate control, but because it stripped away the last illusion Phyllis Summers had been clinging to, the belief that she could win without paying a personal price. For years, Phyllis had survived Genoa City by operating under one unshakable principle: that strength meant never backing down, that control was safety, and that if she could just stay 3 moves ahead of everyone else, the fallout would never truly reach her. She had fought wars in boardrooms, survived public humiliation, outplayed rivals who underestimated her, and rebuilt herself after betrayals that would have broken anyone else. Taking control of Newman Enterprises felt like the ultimate validation, proof that she was still formidable, still untouchable, still the woman who refused to be erased. But the lesson Genoa City delivered to her that day was far crueler and far more permanent than any professional defeat could have been. You can win the company, and still lose the people who matter most. And sometimes, you do not even realize that loss until it is already irreversible. Nick Newman and Sharon Newman did not arrive at the GCC to negotiate or reminisce or soften the blow. There was no small talk, no polite easing into the conversation, no room for Phyllis to deflect with humor or defensiveness. They arrived with a shared purpose, united not by nostalgia or old wounds, but by something far more dangerous to Phyllis than anger: resolve. Nick did not circle the issue or couch his words in concern. He looked at Phyllis and told her plainly that her actions were hurting their daughter, that Summer was unraveling under the weight of the chaos Phyllis had created, and that the damage was no longer abstract or theoretical. It was personal, emotional, and already unfolding. Sharon stood beside him, steady and unflinching, reinforcing every word not with volume but with quiet certainty. She called Phyllis cold. She called her reckless. She called her someone who had stopped seeing the people around her as human beings and started treating them like collateral damage. Coming from anyone else, those words might have sparked a defensive firestorm. Coming from Sharon, a woman who had once been Phyllis's rival and later her unlikely ally, they landed with devastating precision. What made the moment unbearable was not just the criticism itself, but who it came from. Nick and Sharon were not outsiders passing judgment. They were the people who had loved Phyllis in profoundly different ways, at different stages of her life, and who had seen both her best instincts and her most destructive tendencies up close. Nick had loved her with intensity and loyalty, believing again and again that beneath her sharp edges was a woman capable of choosing family over war. Sharon had loved her with understanding, having walked her own path through grief, guilt, and moral reckoning, and having hoped that Phyllis might one day learn to stop mistaking survival for dominance. When both of them stood there and said the same thing, that enough was enough, it should have shaken Phyllis to her core. Instead, she resisted, not with shouting or denial, but with disbelief. She listened, she bristled, and she dismissed their warnings as exaggeration, as emotional manipulation, as fear masquerading as concern. She told herself that Summer would come around, that her daughter understood her better than anyone else ever could, and that this was just another storm she could ride out with time and persistence. Nick's warning cut through that delusion with brutal clarity. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He stated a fact. Summer would not forgive her. Not this time. Not for this. He said it plainly, without cruelty but without mercy, as someone who knew their child well enough to recognize when a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. He told Phyllis that Summer was tired of apologizing for her, tired of cleaning up her messes, tired of being asked to choose between loving her mother and preserving her own sense of right and wrong. He told her that Summer's silence was not temporary anger, but something far more dangerous, the conscious decision to step back before she was pulled down to. Sharon backed him up, pointing out that children do not cut ties impulsively. They do it when they feel unseen, and heard, and forced into roles they never agreed to play. These were not accusations made in anger. They were observations rooted in painful experience, and yet Phyllis did not believe them. Phyllis Summers had built her life on the idea that love could survive anything if it was intense enough, that forgiveness was inevitable if she fought hard enough, and that family bonds, once forged, could not truly be broken. It was a comforting myth, one that allowed her to justify choices she knew, on some level, were destructive. She believed that Summer would rage, retreat, and eventually return, just as so many others had over the years. What she failed to understand was that Summer was no longer a child watching her mother fight the world. She was a grown woman who had learned, painfully, that loyalty without boundaries becomes self-destructs. Nick saw that clearly. Sharon saw it even more clearly. Phyllis saw only what she wanted to see, another conflict she could outlast. That refusal to accept reality was what made the scene so devastating. Not the raised voices or the accusations, but the moment when it became clear that Phyllis was standing on the edge of a loss she did not even recognize as real yet. As Nick and Sharon left the GCC, they did not do so triumphantly. There was no sense of victory in forcing Phyllis to confront the truth. There was only sadness, frustration, and a shared understanding that some lessons cannot be taught, only lived. Phyllis was left alone with the echoes of their words, surrounded by the symbols of a success that suddenly felt hollow. She had the company. She had the power. She had the proof that she could still dominate a city that had tried, many times, to defeat her. But what she did not have, and what she had just been warned she might never have again, was her daughter's trust. And that was the cost she had never truly calculated. Genoa City had taught her many lessons over the years, but this one was the most brutal of all. Winning does not always look like victory. And sometimes the moment you believe you have finally secured everything is the moment you realize you have already lost what mattered most. After Nick and Sharon walked away, leaving behind a silence heavier than any argument, Phyllis did what instinct demanded, not strategy. She reached for her phone. In that moment, she was no longer the woman who had outmaneuvered Victor Newman, no longer the executive who had stood tall beside Kane Ashby while an empire changed hands. She was simply a mother, shaken and unsettled, convinced that whatever damage had been done could still be softened if she spoke to her child directly. Phyllis told herself that Nick and Sharon were wrong, that they were projecting fear and judgment onto a situation they did not fully understand. She believed, with the stubborn confidence that had both saved and ruined her countless times before, that Summer would answer. That her voice alone could still reach her daughter in a way no warning ever could. She dialed, already rehearsing the explanation in her head, not realizing that explanations were no longer what Summer needed or wanted. The call went unanswered. At first, Phyllis barely registered it as a warning. Summer had ignored her before, gone quiet in moments of frustration only to return once emotions cooled. Phyllis waited, pacing, refreshing her screen, certain that the phone would light up at any second. When it didn't, she tried again, her impatience beginning to crack the surface of her confidence. Still nothing. Then the message arrived, and it was not what she expected. There was no anger spilling over the screen, no emotional confrontation, no demand for answers. There were only 7 words, precise and devastating in their restraint. Don't call me anymore. No punctuation, no elaboration, no room for interpretation. Just a boundary, drawn cleanly and without apology. In that instant, something shifted irreversibly. This was not Summer lashing out. This was Summer deciding. The finality of it struck harder than any shouted accusation ever could. Phyllis stared at the screen, rereading the words until they blurred, waiting for the follow-up that never came, the softening clause that would signal this was temporary. It did not arrive. Summer was not asking for space. She was taking it. What made the moment so cruel was its simplicity. There was no dramatic showdown, no raised voices echoing through Genoa City, no opportunity for Phyllis to fight back or talk her way out. Summer did not give her mother something to push against. She simply stepped away. In doing so, she claimed a kind of power Phyllis had always believed belonged only to those willing to dominate. This was not a declaration of war. It was an ending. The realization crept in slowly, sinking deeper with every second Phyllis spent holding that phone, understanding at last what Nick had tried to warn her about. Forgiveness was not being withheld as a punishment. It was no longer on the table at all. Summer had reached the point where continuing to engage would only hurt her further, and she had chosen herself instead. That choice did not require cruelty, just clarity. Phyllis tried, reflexively, to justify what had happened. She told herself that Summer was overwhelmed, that this was an emotional response to stress that would pass. She reminded herself of everything she had sacrificed over the years, every time she had fought tooth and nail to secure a future she believed would ultimately benefit her daughter. She replayed the moments leading up to the takeover, the long nights strategizing with Kane, the warnings she had dismissed, the thrill of standing victorious while Victor Newman vowed she would fall. She had heard the danger in Nick's voice when he told her Summer was hurting, but she had truly believed she could fix it later, that one heartfelt conversation would smooth over the damage. Phyllis had always been good at convincing herself that consequences were negotiable, that relationships, especially familial ones, bent under enough pressure. What she had failed to see was that Summer was no longer willing to bend. From Summer's perspective, the pattern was painfully clear. Again and again, Phyllis had chosen the fight over the fallout, the win over the cost. She had aligned herself with Kane Ashby in a move that sent shockwaves through Genoa City, knowing full well it would destabilize the fragile balancer on her family. She had watched Victor issue a chilling promise of retaliation and responded not with caution, but with celebration. She had listened as Nick voiced concern for their daughter's emotional well-being and dismissed it as something she could manage later. To Summer, this was not about one decision, or even one betrayal. It was about the accumulation of moments where she had been expected to understand, to forgive, to wait patiently while her mother chased another high-stakes victory. Summer had grown up watching Phyllis survive by burning bridges and building new ones out of sheer willpower, and for a long time, she had admired that strength. Eventually, admiration gave way to exhaustion. Loving Phyllis meant constantly bracing for impact, constantly being asked to rationalize behavior that hurt people, including herself. The message she sent was not written in anger, it was written in self-preservation. The irony was brutal. The corporate victory Phyllis had fought so hard to secure was real, undeniable, and complete. Newman Enterprises was no longer under Victor's control. Kane and Phyllis stood at the top of an empire that had defined Genoa City for generations. On paper, it was everything Phyllis had ever wanted: power, validation, proof that she was still a force capable of reshaping the city. But as the reality of Summer's silence settled in, the triumph lost its shine. The offices, the boardrooms, the champagne toasts suddenly felt cavernous and empty. Success had always been loud in Phyllis's life, a rush of adrenaline that drowned out doubt. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she was left alone with the one consequence she could not spin or outmaneuver. The empire she had helped seize could not call her back. It could not forgive her. It could not fill the absence left by a daughter who had decided she was done being collateral damage. Phyllis had always believed that family, no matter how strained, would ultimately bend back into place. Genoa City had taught her that enemies could become allies, that betrayals could be survived, that time softened even the deepest wounds. What this moment forced her to confront was the possibility that some lines, once crossed, do not invite reconciliation. Summer was not waiting for proof that Phyllis loved her. She was demanding proof that Phyllis could put her first, and by the time that demand became clear, it was already too late. The silence that followed that message was not empty. It was full of everything Phyllis had refused to prioritize until it was gone. In the end, the takeover would be remembered as one of the most shocking power shifts Genoa City had ever seen. Kane and Phyllis would be studied, feared, and challenged as the new rulers of Newman Enterprises. But for Phyllis Summers, history would mark this moment differently. It would be the point where victory revealed its true cost. An empire can be built through strategy, alliances, and relentless ambition. It can be defended with money and influence. But it cannot sit across from you at the end of the day and tell you that you matter. It cannot forgive you when you choose it over the people you love. As Phyllis stood alone with her phone, staring at 7 words she could not undo, one truth became impossible to escape. Winning the company had been easy compared to what she had just lost. And no amount of power would ever make eating alone feel like success.